Imagine a palace where
We
gold-lined
must
corridors
consider the
echo not with the
implications of this
laughter of
alliance
children, but
carefully.
with whispers of their disappearance. A royal dynasty draped in jewels and power, feared by its enemies and adored by its subjects, yet haunted by a secret so grotesque, so unthinkable, that even those who lived under its rule dared not speak of it aloud. A bloodline cursed, not to fall to swords, plagues, or betrayal, but to turn inward, devouring its own flesh and blood. The story you are about to hear is not a simple tale of kings and queens, but of a legacy steeped in darkness. For centuries, rumors have clung to this family like a shadow. Whispers of strange appetites, of royal children who vanished without trace, of mothers and fathers whose hunger seemed less human, more primal, more monstrous. To some, these were nothing more than cruel fictions, political smears meant to discredit powerful rulers. To others, they were evidence of something far more chilling. A curse handed down through generations, a hunger written into the blood itself. Cannibalism. Even the word feels forbidden. It conjures visions of savagery, desperation, and madness. But here, it is bound not to starving peasants or desperate soldiers, but to thrones and crowns. A hunger at the very heart of power. And unlike the grand feasts held in glittering halls, these were meals never meant to be witnessed, spoken of, or remembered. Yet the whispers persisted. The question remains, were these monarchs truly cursed to devour their own children, or was the legend a weapon of rumor more powerful than any blade? History often hides its darkest truths in plain sight, buried beneath layers of myth and propaganda. Ancient chroniclers wrote of strange illnesses, of kings who grew pale and restless under the moon, of infants who vanished behind palace walls. Court physicians reported bizarre afflictions they could not cure. Priests muttered about divine punishment. And in the margins of dusty manuscripts, scribes recorded tales that could never be read aloud in the presence of royalty. Was it madness? A disease of the blood? Or a ritual too terrible to confess? We must remember that a royal family was never simply a collection of individuals. It was a symbol, an empire, a dynasty upon which the fate of millions rested. When that dynasty was whispered to eat its own children, the metaphor was as powerful as the alleged truth. A throne devouring its heirs, a crown consuming itself. Yet metaphors, once repeated enough, can begin to warp into reality. And what if, beneath the allegory, there were moments when the curse seemed all too real? Picture the child of a king, heir to unimaginable wealth and power, born beneath banners of silk, swaddled in gold-threaded linens, kissed on the forehead by bishops and queens. Yet as the court rejoiced, someone in the shadows whispered, "This one will not live to see adulthood. The curse will take him." Days stretched into weeks. The child grew pale, restless, and then gone. The official story? Fever. A tragic illness. But behind closed doors, rumors swirled. Some claimed the father, consumed by madness, demanded the child's blood be spilled to appease ancient spirits. Others whispered of feasts that never appeared on palace records. This was not one tragedy, not one coincidence. It was a pattern, a cycle. The dynasty seemed to consume itself, generation after generation. A family that could conquer enemies on the battlefield, yet could not escape the hunger within its own walls. And the people watched, horrified and fascinated, as their ruler's power grew even as their children disappeared. What makes this story so haunting is not only the grotesque possibility of cannibalism, but the silence that surrounds it. Official documents are vague. Chronicles often contradict one another. The few who dared to speak of the curse too plainly often met with exile, or worse. And so, history leaves us with fragments, a whisper in one archive, a strange medical note in another, a half-erased rumor recorded in a monk's private journal. Threads of darkness woven into the fabric of power. Tonight, we will follow those threads. We will walk through gilded corridors where laughter turned to screams. We will uncover the diseases, the madness, and the rituals that could have given birth to such a terrifying legend. And we will ask the question no one dared to speak within those ancient palaces. Did the royal bloodline truly devour its own children? Or was the curse itself the most perfect illusion ever cast upon a dynasty? The truth, as always, lies in the shadows. But one thing is certain. In the world of kings and queens, no crown comes without a cost. And for this bloodline, the price may have been the flesh and blood of their own heirs. To understand how a dynasty could become so feared, so whispered about, we must return to its very beginning, when the first stone of its legacy was laid, and when the first shadow fell across its name. Every great royal house begins with a story. Some claim descent from gods, others from warriors who carved kingdoms out of blood and fire. But this bloodline, its origin was stranger. Chroniclers describe its founders as touched by the divine, yet also cursed by the same heavens they worshipped. A family whose rise to power was marked not by the shining light of destiny, but by omens that even the priests hesitated to record. The earliest records tell of a warlord whose hunger for power seemed endless. He rose from obscurity, uniting tribes that had feuded for centuries, carving out a kingdom with sword and flame. Yet there are whispers that his victories came at a terrible price. Before each battle, it was said, he withdrew into a tent draped in black cloth, emerging only after hours of silence and chanting. Those close to him claimed he never entered alone. Children were chosen, always the youngest captives of war. They were brought inside, and they never returned. His enemies said this was barbarism, ritual slaughter, the drinking of blood to make him invincible. His followers, however, spoke of sacrifice, an offering to ensure victory. When the warlord finally crowned himself king, the skies reportedly darkened with a sudden storm. Thunder cracked as the crown touched his head. For the priests, it was a sign of divine approval. For the common people, it was a sign of warning. From the very beginning, the dynasty's power was stained with rumors of blood. As the kingdom grew, so did the stories. The king's children were born healthy, strong, and beautiful, at least at first. But strange fates awaited them. One daughter reportedly wasted away, pale and trembling, unable to bear the touch of sunlight. A son died after convulsions no physician could explain. Another simply vanished from the palace one night, his disappearance blamed on a servant who was executed before he could speak. The pattern was set. Heirs who should have secured the dynasty's future seemed destined to disappear before adulthood. And yet, despite these tragedies, the family's power only grew. Surrounding lords and rival dynasties whispered that the king and queen drew strength from these losses, that every child who died gave life, in some twisted way, back to the throne. The more the heirs fell, the stronger the dynasty's grip became. Religious figures were divided. Some saw the bloodline as chosen by the gods, their children sacrificed as holy offerings to maintain divine favor. Others condemned the family as cursed, their power fueled by unholy practices that mocked heaven itself. This duality, divine blessing versus monstrous curse, would haunt the dynasty for generations. And then there were the omens. Chroniclers describe flocks of crows circling above the palace each time a royal child was born. They tell of strange marks appearing on the infant's skin, shapes resembling teeth or claw marks, which vanished after a few days but were recorded in secret by midwives. Astrologers declared the family's birth signs as cursed, warning that the stars themselves foretold blood. Yet despite these warnings, the dynasty thrived. Their wealth expanded, their influence spread, and their reputation as untouchable rulers solidified. Behind the golden facade, however, the shadows grew darker. Palace servants whispered of midnight screams, of wet smears on the floors hastily scrubbed away by morning. Foreign ambassadors carried rumors back to their homelands, rumors of feasts not written in the court records, where dishes were served in silence and where no one spoke of what was eaten. The dynasty denied it all, of course. To them, these were lies crafted by jealous enemies, desperate to undermine their throne. And yet, the rumors never truly died. The strangest detail is how often the dynasty itself leaned into these whispers. Some kings adorned their banners with symbols of teeth and open jaws, claiming they represented strength and dominance. Certain queens wore necklaces shaped like dripping fangs, jewels crafted to resemble drops of blood. Officially, these were symbols of victory and eternal life, but to their subjects, they were chilling reminders of the family's curse. Was it arrogance? Was it an inside joke, mocking the peasants who gossiped in the streets? Or was it a hidden confession, flaunted in plain sight? By the second generation, the dynasty's identity was inseparable from the curse. Foreign rulers feared marrying into the bloodline, yet at the same time, they craved the alliance, for the dynasty's power seemed untouchable. And so, marriages continued. Princesses were sent to other courts, often falling ill within months. Princes took foreign brides who mysteriously lost their firstborn children. Every tragedy deepened the legend, and every death tightened the curse's grip. The dynasty's chroniclers tried to rewrite the story, painting the family as blessed martyrs, sacrificing their children for the survival of the realm. Their enemies countered with pamphlets and secret songs, calling them monsters who feasted on their young. Somewhere between these extremes, the truth blurred into myth. And in that blur, the darkness only deepened. What we see here is not just the rise of a royal family, but the birth of a legend, one that would follow them for centuries. A family powerful enough to conquer nations, yet powerless to escape the shadow of their own name. A bloodline destined to rule, yet cursed to consume itself from within. The origins of this dynasty set the stage for everything that followed. The missing heirs, the whispered feasts, the rituals cloaked in secrecy. The curse was not a story invented later to explain their downfall. It was there from the very beginning, intertwined with their first victories, their first coronations, their first births. A crown forged not only of gold, but of blood. And so, as we step deeper into their history, we must ask ourselves, was this a family truly cursed by the gods, or did the dynasty create its own curse through hunger, ambition, and secrecy? Perhaps the line between curse and choice was never as clear as history wants us to believe. If the origins of the dynasty were born in blood and shadow, its continuation was marked by something even more unsettling: the slow unraveling of mind and body. To the outside world, this was a house of power, commanding armies, dictating the fates of nations. But within the palace walls, the dynasty's legacy was plagued by sickness, mysterious afflictions that no physician could name, and madness that spread like a hereditary curse. The chronicles of the time are filled with descriptions that, even centuries later, chill the reader to the bone. Kings who wandered the corridors at night, muttering to themselves and scratching at their own skin until it bled. Queens who shrieked during banquets, suddenly convinced their wine goblets were filled with blood. Princes who could not bear the touch of sunlight, their skin blistering as though cursed. Each case was explained away by court physicians as an unfortunate illness, but in the eyes of the people, these were signs of something darker, a family descending into madness, driven by the same hunger that supposedly devoured their heirs. Modern historians have tried to make sense of these stories. Some point to hereditary diseases that thrive in closed royal bloodlines. Porphyria, for instance, a rare condition that causes sensitivity to light, hallucinations, and red-stained urine, has been suggested as one culprit. Imagine a pale young prince, his body racked with pain each time the sun touched his skin, his mind clouded with visions. To the physicians of the time, this was inexplicable. To his terrified servants, it was proof that the curse lived within his blood. Others argue that the dynasty's madness may have sprung from generations of inbreeding. Royal families were notorious for marrying cousins, uncles, and nieces, desperate to preserve the purity of their line. Such unions tightened the grip of inherited diseases, producing children with fragile bodies and fractured minds. What the physicians saw as melancholia or lunacy may have been the inevitable result of bloodlines drawn too close together. And yet, for the people who watched their rulers stumble into madness, it was easier, far more terrifying, to believe the curse itself was tightening its hold. But there were symptoms that defy explanation, even today. Court records describe sudden outbursts of violent hunger, princes tearing at raw meat with their bare hands, noble women refusing cooked meals, claiming they could only taste the life in food when it was fresh and red. Servants swore they found bones hidden beneath palace floors, scraps gnawed to the marrow. Physicians insisted these were symptoms of hysteria, of nervous imbalance. But whispers grew louder. Perhaps the curse was no metaphor, but a hunger for flesh. The madness did not remain hidden behind gilded doors. At times, it spilled into public view, shocking entire courts. One king, celebrated for his military victories, is said to have hosted a banquet in which he sat silent, refusing to eat the roasted game and delicacies before him. Then, In full view of his horrified guests, he bit into his own arm until blood ran down his sleeve. The hall fell silent, nobles frozen in place, until guards rushed to restrain him. Officially, the event was dismissed as an epileptic fit, but those who witnessed it swore the king's eyes glowed with hunger, not madness. Another queen, remembered in poems for her beauty, was said to spend her nights whispering lullabies to infants who were not there. When confronted, she claimed the palace children had been taken by shadows, and that she alone could still hear their cries. Within weeks, 2 young heirs mysteriously disappeared from the nursery. The queen's attendants later testified that she walked into the royal kitchens on the same night, her white gown stained crimson. No official record confirmed the rumor, yet the whispers spread like wildfire. It was not just the rulers who suffered. Even distant relatives of the dynasty displayed strange behaviors. Cousins raised in far-off provinces were said to bite themselves until they bled. Nieces who married into foreign courts were plagued by sudden madness, waking in the night screaming that they had tasted their own children in their dreams. Over time, the family tree itself began to look like a map of decay, each branch twisted by illness, each leaf withering under the same shadow. The dynasty attempted to control the narrative. Physicians were sworn to secrecy. Priests were ordered to declare the illnesses divine trials, signs of holy suffering that bound the rulers closer to the heavens. Pamphlets proclaimed the family as chosen, enduring pains no mortal could bear. But in the taverns, in the markets, and in the homes of ordinary people, the whispers grew darker. The people began to believe their rulers were not suffering, they were changing, becoming something other than human. What makes these accounts even more chilling is the timing. Many of the episodes of madness coincided with the deaths of royal children. A prince's breakdown would follow the disappearance of his newborn heir. A queen's shrieking visions would erupt just days after her daughter's funeral. To some, this was grief, a mind torn apart by loss. But to others, the link was too strong, too precise. Each child lost was another spark that seemed to ignite the family's descent into madness. The curse, it seemed, was both cause and consequence, feeding itself endlessly. And yet, despite all this illness, despite all this madness, the dynasty remained unbroken. Their armies still marched, their coffers overflowed, their banners flew proudly above conquered lands. How could a family so fractured, so diseased, continue to dominate history? For their subjects, there was only one answer. The curse did not weaken them, it sustained them. Each child lost, each fit of madness, was the price of their enduring power. It is here, in this terrifying contradiction, that the legend of the dynasty deepens. Were they victims of inherited disease, trapped by their own blood? Were they pawns of propaganda, their enemies painting illness as monstrosity? Or were they truly cursed, condemned to hunger for their own offspring as the fuel for their survival? Whatever the truth, the legacy of illness and madness became as much a part of the dynasty's identity as their crowns and palaces. They were rulers draped in gold, yet trembling in darkness. Kings who commanded nations, yet could not command their own minds. Queens worshipped for their beauty, yet feared for the screams that echoed through the night. In the end, the curse was not whispered only by enemies or peasants. It was etched into the dynasty's very image. To speak their name was to invoke both reverence and revulsion. They were living paradoxes, sovereigns and monsters, chosen and cursed, human and inhuman. A dynasty shrouded in illness, wrapped in madness, and forever haunted by the question of what truly coursed through their veins. Whispers are fragile things. They begin as faint murmurs, flickering between servants in darkened hallways, exchanged in trembling voices after the candles are blown out. But in a royal court, where every glance, every rumor can tip the balance of power, a whisper is never just a whisper. It grows, it spreads, and in time, it can become more dangerous than any sword. Within this dynasty's palaces, the whispers were unlike any others. They spoke not of simple corruption or treason, but of feasts that should never have been. Banquets where the laughter of nobles masked a silence far more sinister. Dishes presented with exquisite care, yet carrying flavors no one dared identify. Behind closed doors, the rulers of this bloodline were accused of indulging in the most unthinkable of appetites, the flesh of their own children. The first accounts are hushed, almost tentative. Chroniclers write of strange meals and forbidden foods, never naming the act outright. One courtier described a late-night gathering where the king refused all offerings of venison and lamb, demanding instead a dish that came from the nursery, not the kitchen. The account was vague, almost deliberately obscured, yet the implication was clear enough to chill the bones of anyone who read it. Over time, the whispers sharpened. A letter smuggled from one ambassador to another claimed that during a winter famine, the dynasty hosted a secret feast, even as their people starved outside the palace walls. The servants who prepared the meal never spoke again. Their families vanished. Yet one broken fragment of testimony survived, that the meat served that night was tender, pale, and child-sized. And then there are the stories of the midnight kitchens. Servants recalled being awoken by bells at unnatural hours, summoned to prepare meals for the king or queen. But these were not meals of roasted game or delicate pastries. They were raw, bloody, steaming with an iron scent that clung to the air long after dawn. One cook, desperate to ease his conscience, confessed to a priest that he had prepared dishes using flesh that did not come from the market. He was found dead days later, his body hung in the scullery as a warning to others. Enemies of the dynasty seized upon these stories with glee. Pamphlets circulated in foreign courts, painting the rulers as monsters who consumed their own bloodline. Songs were sung in taverns, mocking the royal appetite with verses too obscene to be repeated here. And yet, for all the mockery, the whispers carried a strange power. Even those who despised the dynasty hesitated to cross them, as if fearing that such hunger might be turned outward, devouring not just their children but their entire kingdoms. But the most chilling accounts came not from enemies, but from those within the court itself. A lady-in-waiting once claimed to have stumbled into the royal dining chamber at night, only to see her queen seated before a silver plate smeared red, her hands trembling as she lifted something small and unrecognizable to her lips. When their eyes met, the queen smiled. The lady fled and never returned to court. Her name disappears from the records shortly after, erased as though she had never existed. Another tale speaks of a prince who fell gravely ill. Physicians tended to him for days, yet his condition worsened until he slipped into death. His funeral was arranged with great haste, the body sealed in a coffin that no one was permitted to open. But a servant swore that he had seen the child's remains earlier, already carved, already missing parts that no disease could ever explain. Skeptics argue that these stories were exaggerations, tales spun by enemies and malcontents to slander the dynasty. Cannibalism is the ultimate taboo, and to accuse a ruler of such a crime was to paint them as less than human, unfit to govern. Yet what makes the whispers so compelling is how persistent they were. Generation after generation, in palace after palace, the same rumors echoed. Children missing, banquets unrecorded, rulers seen with blood on their lips. The whispers also reveal something more symbolic. To many, the idea of a dynasty devouring its children was not merely literal, it was metaphorical. It spoke of rulers so consumed by power that they sacrificed their heirs to maintain control. Children became pawns, marriages became tools, and those who threatened the dynasty's stability were quietly erased. What better way to explain these disappearances than to claim the rulers had consumed their own flesh and blood? Yet symbolism does not explain the details. The stains found on royal linens, the midnight screams from the nursery, the servants who disappeared after speaking too freely. Too many fragments point towards something more than rumor, something unspoken but deeply feared. And perhaps most terrifying of all were the rituals. Accounts suggest that when certain heirs died, their bodies were not buried in the royal crypts, but taken to hidden chambers beneath the palace. There, the rulers would consume part of the child, sometimes a heart, sometimes blood mixed into wine. This was said to grant strength, to preserve the dynasty's power, to ward off enemies. Whether these accounts are truth or twisted propaganda, they painted a picture that has endured for centuries, a family so desperate to cling to power that they would literally feed upon their own. Imagine, for a moment, what it meant to live in such a court, to serve a king whose eyes lingered too long on the children of the palace, to pour wine into a queen's goblet, not knowing if it held grapes or blood, to watch the royal nursery doors close each night, praying that the laughter inside would survive until morning. The whispers became so powerful that even loyal subjects grew uneasy. Parents began to fear sending their children to court as pages or companions. Nobles kept their heirs far from the palace, disguising their absences with excuses of illness or travel. The dynasty, once a symbol of security, became a shadow under which no child was safe. And yet, despite these whispers, despite the terror they inspired, the dynasty endured. They sat upon their thrones with serene expressions, smiling as though nothing were amiss. They held festivals, parades, and ceremonies, projecting an image of order and magnificence. To their people, this contradiction was the most frightening of all. How could a family accused of such monstrous crimes maintain such calm, such unbroken control? Unless, of course, the whispers were true, and the curse was their strength. By the time the rumors had spread across continents, the dynasty's reputation was no longer merely human. They had become something more, rulers who were feared not just for their armies, but for the possibility that they were creatures of appetite, cursed to feast upon the very children who should have carried their legacy forward. Whether truth, slander, or something in between, the whispers of cannibalism defined the dynasty as much as their victories and crowns. And once a whisper takes root in the human imagination, it is nearly impossible to erase. Every dynasty has its rulers who rise above the rest, figures whose reigns define the bloodline for centuries. And within this cursed family, certain monarchs stood at the very heart of the whispers. They were not merely subjects of rumor. They became the living embodiment of the curse itself. Monarchs remembered not for their laws or victories, but for the darkness that seemed to consume them. The first of these was a king who ascended the throne in a blaze of triumph. He had defeated his rivals in a brutal civil war, securing his dynasty's claim once and for all. But behind the pageantry of his coronation, he carried a secret no crown could conceal. Chroniclers describe him as restless, sleepless, wandering the halls at night, like a predator pacing in a cage. Servants swore he demanded raw meat from the kitchens, sometimes tearing at it with his teeth before it was even placed on a plate. His reign was marked by military brilliance, but also by an unease that seeped into the very air of the court. It was during his rule that the first accusations of cannibalism truly took hold. One heir died mysteriously, and though the physicians blamed fever, whispers claimed the king himself had demanded the boy's blood as an offering for victory. Then came his queen, perhaps the most chilling figure of all. She was renowned for her beauty, celebrated in poems as a vision of light. Yet in the private chambers of the palace, she was a creature of shadow. Records describe her as erratic, swinging between moments of tenderness and sudden violence. Nurses spoke of her entering the nursery in the middle of the night, cradling her children with a gaze that seemed more possessive than maternal. More than one child vanished under her care, their deaths explained away with convenient stories of illness. But one lady-in-waiting wrote in secret that she had once seen the queen emerge from the nursery with her lips stained red, her eyes shining with a hunger that made the witness flee in terror. That account was never intended for public view. It was hidden in a private diary discovered centuries later, but it remains one of the most disturbing glimpses into the curse. Generations later, another monarch would embody the bloodline's darkest reputation. He was a warrior king, tall, imposing, beloved by his soldiers. Yet even on the battlefield, his behavior unsettled those around him. After victories, he was said to linger among the dead, not to mourn or pray, but to touch the bodies with strange reverence. Captured prisoners often disappeared after his feasts of celebration. One surviving mercenary claimed to have seen the king tear flesh from a fallen enemy, chewing it with a calm expression as though it were no different from roasted meat. Whether this was truth or slander, it fueled a legend that followed him through his reign, that his strength came not from training or skill, but from consuming the lives of others. But perhaps the most tragic figure was a young prince who briefly wore the crown before succumbing to the curse in the most grotesque way. He was described as fragile, delicate, almost ethereal. His court adored him, believing he would finally break the cycle of madness that haunted the dynasty. For a time, it seemed possible. He ruled with kindness, spoke with gentleness, and promised reforms that gave hope to a weary people. Yet behind the palace walls, his affliction grew. Witnesses claimed he suffered visions, dreams in which he was hunted by his ancestors, their mouths dripping with blood. He awoke screaming, demanding raw food brought to him before dawn. One account tells of a banquet where, mid-speech, he suddenly collapsed into violent hunger, grabbing a roasted bird from the table and devouring it with his hands, bones cracking beneath his teeth as nobles watched in stunned silence. Weeks later, he died suddenly, his body found pale and wasted. The official record cites mysterious illness, but the whispers claimed something far more terrible, that he had turned upon his own infant child before his body finally gave out. These monarchs, king, queen, warrior, and prince, are not remembered equally. Some are hailed in official histories as great rulers, their darker deeds carefully buried beneath victories and alliances. Others are painted outright as monsters, their names invoked as warnings for future generations. Yet together, they form the core of the dynasty's legend, proof, to those who believe the curse, that it was real, inescapable, and merciless. What is most haunting is how often these figures seemed aware of the whispers. The warrior king who wore armor etched with fanged mouths, as though mocking the stories of his appetite. The queen who posed for portraits holding not flowers or books, but a chalice, its contents suspiciously dark. Even the gentle prince, in one of his final public appearances, is said to have declared, "The blood of kings is not for inheritance, but for sacrifice." Was this madness? A confession? Or simply the ramblings of a man unraveling beneath the weight of his destiny? The monarchs at the heart of the curse were not merely victims of rumor. They shaped it, fed it, and, in some cases, seemed to embrace it. Their reigns are remembered less as chapters in political history and more as episodes in a horror that spanned generations. They remind us that power and monstrosity often walked hand in hand, that a crown could shine brightly even as it concealed teeth dripping in the dark. And as long as their dynasty endured, so too did the fear that every new ruler would carry the same hunger, the same shadow, the same curse. Every dynasty depends on its heirs. Children were more than family. They were the promise of tomorrow, the living guarantee that a bloodline would endure. Yet in this cursed house, children were not symbols of hope. They were symbols of fear. Each birth was shadowed by suspicion, each cry of an infant carrying not joy, but dread. Because in this dynasty, children were not destined to inherit power. They were destined to vanish. The chronicles are littered with small coffins and hurried funerals. Princes and princesses who survived only months, sometimes days. Heirs proclaimed with ceremony, paraded before the people, only to disappear behind the palace gates and never be seen again. Official explanations were predictable: illness, accidents, sudden fever. But to those who lived within the walls, the truth was whispered with trembling lips. The dynasty was consuming its children. One of the earliest tragedies recorded is that of a firstborn prince, hailed as the hope of a kingdom fractured by war. His birth was celebrated with bells, feasts, and proclamations of divine blessing. Yet before his third birthday, he was gone. Physicians claimed he had succumbed to a wasting sickness, his body unable to hold food. But rumors swirled that the child's meals had been tampered with, his weakness induced deliberately. Some claimed the king himself ordered the boy bled, his vital essence, consumed in secret to grant strength to the throne. Another case tells of twin daughters, born to a queen already whispered to be unstable. The nursery rang with laughter for a few brief months, until one morning, only one cradle remained. The surviving twin grew up pale, anxious, and silent, haunted by the absence of the sister whose name was never spoken. When she reached her teens, she too was found lifeless, her body cold in bed. The queen announced she had died of fever, but a maidservant, in a confession recorded by a priest, claimed she had seen the queen pressing a bloodied cloth to the girl's lips in her final moments. These tragedies multiplied with each generation. Sons born to rule never reached manhood. Daughters destined for alliances were buried before their betrothals could be arranged. Entire nurseries became chambers of silence. It was as though the dynasty's future was being devoured from within, leaving only the present rulers alive, clutching desperately to their thrones. The most haunting testimonies come from those who served closest to the children. Nannies spoke of being locked out of nurseries at night, forbidden from attending their charges after dusk. One wet nurse described a king entering the nursery in silence, dismissing her with a wave, then carrying his infant son away. By morning, the cradle was empty. The nurse never worked in the palace again, her fate unrecorded. In another account, a young page recalled being summoned to deliver food to the royal kitchens late at night. What he found there would haunt him until his dying day. A silver platter prepared for the king, bearing not a cut of venison or boar, but something disturbingly small, wrapped in cloth. The boy fled, never speaking of it until years later, when age had loosened his tongue. His testimony, preserved in fragments, was dismissed by officials as the ramblings of a senile mind. But for those who already believed the curse, it confirmed their worst fears. What makes these accounts all the more tragic is the innocence of the victims. These were not rival claimants or rebellious nobles. They were children, helpless, voiceless, unable to resist whatever fate the dynasty had marked for them. In many ways, their suffering became the heart of the curse itself. For what could be more unnatural, more horrifying, than parents devouring their own offspring? Symbolically, too, the pattern is undeniable. Each lost child represented not just a broken family, but a broken future. A dynasty that destroyed its heirs was a dynasty feeding upon itself, consuming the very bloodline it was meant to preserve. It is here that the curse becomes both literal and metaphorical. Whether or not flesh was truly consumed, the dynasty's hunger for survival was fed by the deaths of its children. There are also suggestions of ritual. Some accounts describe ceremonies held in secret chambers beneath the palace, where infants were offered as sacrifices to ensure the dynasty's strength. In these tales, the children were not victims of random misfortune, but deliberate offerings, pieces of the dynasty's own flesh traded for power. Such practices may have been exaggerated by enemies, yet the repetition of these rumors across generations suggests they carried at least a grain of truth. Even in art, the theme appears. Tapestries commissioned by the dynasty depict strange scenes of beasts devouring their young, cloaked in symbolic language but unmistakable in their imagery. Portraits of royal children often seem unsettling, the expressions vacant, the eyes haunted. Were these artistic choices innocent, or subtle acknowledgments of a reality too dark to state plainly? Perhaps the most disturbing thought of all is how normalized these tragedies became. By the dynasty's later years, the death of a royal child was no longer shocking. It was expected. Announcements of infant funerals were made with cold efficiency. The people mourned, but without surprise. Servants whispered that no child in the palace could ever be safe. And nobles, though horrified, continued to send their daughters to marry into the bloodline, accepting that their grandchildren might never live beyond infancy. The curse had become part of the dynasty's identity, woven into its legacy as tightly as its victories and conquests. The children, then, were more than victims. They were sacrifices, whether literal or symbolic, offered to sustain a family that refused to fall. Their innocence was extinguished to preserve crowns and thrones. Their silence became the foundation upon which the dynasty's power rested. And yet, their absence never truly faded. Every empty cradle, every vanished heir, became a ghost haunting the palace corridors. The dynasty might have devoured its children, but it could never erase the memory of what was lost. For in the end, it is the children, their laughter silenced, their futures stolen, who remind us of the curse's true horror. Not the crowns, not the power, not the whispers of ritual, but the tragedy of innocence consumed by its own bloodline. If the whispers of cannibalism were shocking, what lay beneath them was even more chilling. The suggestion that these acts were not random, not the deranged impulses of a few cursed rulers, but part of an ancient pattern. A ritual, a hunger cultivated, preserved, and sanctified by secrecy. Throughout history, every civilization has known rites of blood. From the sacrifices of Mesopotamia to the heart offerings of the Aztecs, blood has always been seen as the ultimate currency of life. But in this dynasty, blood was not just offered, it was consumed. To eat the flesh of kin was not simply barbarity, but a way of channeling divine power. Fragments of texts, recovered from burned manuscripts, hint at ceremonies hidden from the eyes of the church and state. One fragment, attributed to a palace priest who later fled, describes a midnight ritual where the monarch, veiled in black, was presented with a chalice of thickened wine. Yet his account notes that no vineyards had produced such a vintage. The chalice, he claimed, contained the lifeblood of an heir sacrificed hours earlier. It was drunk in silence, the chamber lit only by torches shaped like open mouths. Other accounts tell of feasts held on nights of eclipse. The royal family gathered in subterranean halls, away from the gaze of commoners and clergy. There, they were said to consume roasted flesh not of animals, but of those considered chosen vessels, young heirs whose lives were believed to ensure the dynasty's strength. The ritual was not viewed as cruelty, but as necessity, a grim duty to sustain the line. In these chambers, the curse became tradition, and hunger became heritage. One particularly disturbing legend speaks of a ritual called the Crimson Baptism. In this ceremony, newborns were washed not with water, but with blood, sometimes their own, sometimes that of an older sibling. The belief was that by marking the child with blood, the family could transfer the curse from the dynasty into the child's body, ensuring the monarch's continued vitality. Few of these baptized infants survived long. Their brief lives were considered offerings, their deaths celebrated as sacrifices rather than mourned as tragedies. The use of symbolism was everywhere. The dynasty's crest itself, once a proud emblem of conquest, evolved into something unsettling. Artists began depicting it with hidden mouths, jagged shapes resembling teeth. Coins minted during the later reigns bore strange designs, serpents swallowing their own tails, mothers cradling infants with hollow eyes. Even architecture reflected this obsession. Arches shaped like jaws, banquet halls designed with acoustics that echoed like cavernous gullets. These were not coincidences. They were markers of identity, a dynasty embracing its reputation, turning whispers into symbols carved in stone. It is tempting to dismiss these tales as exaggerations, propaganda spread by enemies eager to tarnish the family's name. And yet, the consistency of the accounts across centuries is difficult to ignore. Different writers, from different lands, described similar rituals: the chalices, the feasts, the eclipses, the sacrifice of children. Could so many voices be lying, or were they all echoing a terrible truth? The most unnerving possibility is that these rituals were not born of madness, but of belief. That the dynasty truly thought consuming their own gave them strength, longevity, and power. In this light, the curse becomes self-fulfilling. Rulers convinced they were doomed to hunger enacted the very practices that sustained the legend. The more they believed, the more real it became. Survivors who escaped the palace spoke of strange transformations. They claimed the rulers' eyes gleamed unnaturally in firelight, that their skin bore an unhealthy pallor, that their nails grew sharp as if hardened by some internal change. These details sound like the flourishes of folklore, yet they mirror ancient fears across cultures. The idea that consuming human flesh transforms not only the body, but the soul. To eat of your kin is to invite corruption, to welcome darkness into your veins. Perhaps this was the true curse, not supernatural vengeance, but the gradual dehumanization of rulers who became prisoners of their own appetite. Even death itself seemed bound to ritual. The funerals of these monarchs were strange affairs. Corpses were sealed in iron coffins, locked tight, as though the living feared the dead might rise again. Some were buried beneath layers of salt, others beneath slabs carved with prayers against hunger. The dynasty may have devoured its children, but it feared its own dead most of all. And still, the rituals left their legacy. Centuries later, visitors claimed to hear strange noises beneath the ruins of the dynasty's palaces, low chants, echoes of feasts, the wailing of children long gone. Archaeologists uncovered bones with marks of deliberate cutting, buried not in graves, but in banquet pits. And in the dust of forgotten libraries, scraps of forbidden texts resurface, whispering of the hunger that once ruled kings. The forbidden rituals of this dynasty blur the line between fact and legend. Were they truly carried out in blood-stained chambers, or were they the inventions of horrified witnesses trying to explain a curse they could not understand? Either way, the effect is the same. The dynasty is remembered not as a family of rulers, but as a cult of hunger, an empire that fed upon itself, sanctifying the unthinkable, cloaking atrocity in the language of ritual. For if there is one truth in history, it is this: when the powerful believe their survival depends on sacrifice, no boundary is sacred, no taboo unbroken. And in the case of this cursed bloodline, even the flesh of their own children was not beyond reach. The curse of this bloodline did not end at the palace gates. Its shadow stretched across borders, across centuries, infecting politics, religion, and even folklore. Whether or not the rulers truly consumed their own children, the belief that they did was powerful enough to shape history itself. Neighboring kingdoms watched with suspicion. Diplomatic marriages, normally the lifeblood of alliances, became a gamble. To send a daughter into the dynasty was to risk her bearing children who might never survive infancy. Still, rulers often accepted the risk, drawn by the family's wealth and influence. Yet when the heirs of such unions vanished mysteriously, foreign courts erupted in fury. Treaties dissolved, wars ignited, and blood was spilled not only in cradles, but on battlefields. In this way, the dynasty's private curse became a public catastrophe, destabilizing entire regions. The church, too, was forced to reckon with the rumors. Clerics preached that the dynasty was cursed by God, punished for sins beyond imagination. Priests denounced them in fiery sermons, comparing their hunger to that of demons who devour souls. Yet, paradoxically, the dynasty often funded cathedrals, monasteries, and pilgrimages, using piety to mask its shadows. Was this an act of repentance or a strategic disguise? The contradiction only deepened the mystery. To the faithful, the rulers became living examples of sin, proof that even the most powerful could be corrupted by unholy appetites. In literature and art, their legacy took on mythic proportions. Poets whispered of the Crimson Banquet, a feast where kings drank the blood of their heirs under a blackened moon. Painters created allegories in which lions devoured their cubs, or mothers cradled children with skeletal hands. These works were rarely labeled openly, yet audiences knew exactly who they represented. Over time, the dynasty blurred into archetype, no longer merely rulers, but symbols of monstrous parenthood, embodiments of the fear that love could curdle into hunger. Even common folklore absorbed the curse. Tales of the child-eating king became bedtime warnings, stories told to frighten children into obedience. Parents whispered that if they misbehaved, the cursed monarch would rise from his grave and feast upon them. Songs sung by peasants in hushed tones carried verses about princes who vanished, queens who drank from silver chalices, and ghosts of infants who haunted palace walls. The dynasty's reputation outlived their reign, becoming part of cultural memory itself. Politically, the curse weakened the family over generations. Rival dynasties used the rumors as weapons, branding their enemies as inhuman, unfit to rule. Rebellions cited the curse as justification, claiming no people should be ruled by cannibals. And when famine struck the land, commoners whispered that their rulers devoured children while they starved, a dangerous belief that fueled uprisings. In the end, it was not just military defeats or economic struggles that eroded the dynasty's power, but the intangible weight of their reputation. No matter how many churches they built, how many armies they led, the stain of hunger could not be washed away. The collapse of the dynasty did not silence the curse, it magnified it. When their line finally ended, historians recorded their downfall as divine justice. Chroniclers framed their extinction as inevitable, the final payment for crimes too dark to forgive. This framing influenced generations of scholars, who cited the dynasty as proof that corruption always devours itself. Whether they truly ate their children or not became irrelevant. The belief was enough to ensure that their name would forever be tied to monstrosity. Centuries later, the legend continues to surface in unexpected places. Gothic writers of the 19th century resurrected the imagery of cursed bloodlines, haunted palaces, and rulers who devoured their kin. Modern horror stories, too, borrow heavily from the myth, transforming history into allegory. Even today, the phrase "they eat their own" echoes in political rhetoric, a faint ghost of the original curse. But perhaps the most chilling part of the dynasty's legacy is how it still resonates in silence. Visit the ruins of their castles, and you will find local guides eager to whisper stories of haunted nurseries, secret tunnels, and bloodstained stones. Archaeologists uncover bones with suspicious markings and struggle to explain them without invoking the curse. Museums quietly display artifacts with inscriptions too unsettling for casual visitors. The dynasty may have vanished, but its shadow refuses to die. There is a strange irony in this legacy. For a family so obsessed with preserving its power, the result was the opposite. Their attempts to strengthen themselves through forbidden acts only ensured that their reputation would be remembered for horror, not glory. Their victories in battle, their patronage of art, their architectural wonders, all of it is forgotten in the public imagination, eclipsed by the single narrative of the curse. History reduced them not to kings and queens, but to monsters. And in the end, this may be the truest form of damnation, not the loss of life, but the loss of legacy. To be remembered not as rulers, but as devourers. To have their name endure, not for triumphs, but for whispers of blood. The dynasty's wider impact, then, is twofold. On one hand, it shaped politics, culture, and religion during their own era, destabilizing kingdoms and fueling fear. On the other, it transcended history altogether, becoming myth, an eternal reminder of how easily humanity's darkest instincts can define a family, a nation, even an entire age. For those centuries have passed, one truth remains. When we speak of cursed bloodlines, of rulers who consume their own, we are still speaking of them. Their hunger has never truly ended. It lives on in memory, in legend, in the stories we still whisper in the dark. Every story has an ending. But for this dynasty, the ending was not victory, nor peace, nor glory. It was silence, a silence heavy with absence. Empty cradles, sealed coffins, deserted palaces. The bloodline that once ruled with iron and fire faded into whispers, swallowed by the very hunger that had defined it for centuries. The official histories explain their fall in familiar terms: political decline, rebellion, the rise of stronger rivals. Yet the people remembered it differently. To them, the dynasty was not overthrown, it was devoured, consumed by its own curse. Their collapse was not just an ending, but a reckoning. As though every child lost, every ritual whispered in secret, had finally risen to drag the family into darkness. Even now, centuries later, the story feels unfinished. Visit the ruins of their castles, and you will find locals lowering their voices as dusk falls. They will tell you that the cries of children still echo in the night air, carried on the wind through broken halls. Some say the stones themselves are stained, not with moss or age, but with blood that will never wash away. Others speak of shadows moving through the ruins, figures crowned and robed, their mouths open as if in eternal hunger. Perhaps these are only legends, but legends have power, and this dynasty's power lies not in what can be proven, but in what can never be fully dismissed. Were they truly cursed to devour their children, or were the rumors the product of propaganda, jealousy, and fear? The answer may never be known, but what matters is that people believed it. Entire generations grew up convinced that their rulers fed upon innocence, and that belief was strong enough to outlast kingdoms, wars, and centuries. In this way, the curse was immortal. For even if no flesh was ever consumed, the dynasty still ate itself, through suspicion, fear, and obsession. Its rulers destroyed their own future, suffocating their children beneath the weight of a legacy they could not escape. Hunger may not have lived in their bellies, but it lived in their minds, and that was enough. What, then, is the lesson of this cursed bloodline? That power always demands sacrifice. That belief can be more destructive than truth. Or that the darkest monsters are often not strangers at all, but those bound to us by blood? Perhaps it is all of these at once. Perhaps the dynasty's fate is a warning written in history's shadows, reminding us that when family becomes currency and legacy becomes obsession, humanity itself is the price. And so the dynasty's story ends not with triumph, but with a question that lingers long after the names and dates have faded. What would you do to preserve your power, your bloodline, your name? Would you break taboos, betray faith, sacrifice those you love most? The cursed dynasty answered that question with hunger. We, the living, can only shudder at their choice and wonder if, in some hidden corner of history yet to be uncovered, the same hunger still waits. Because in the end, the curse of this dynasty is not theirs alone. It is a reflection of something buried deep in human nature, the temptation to consume in order to survive, to preserve legacy at any cost. And as long as that hunger exists within us, the curse has never truly ended. It lingers still in memory, in myth, and perhaps in blood. History never truly disappears. It mutates, reshapes, and reemerges in ways we often fail to recognize. The dynasty that consumed its children may have vanished, its castles crumbling into ruin, its rulers reduced to whispers. But its curse, the hunger for legacy at any cost, still stalks the world today. We may no longer speak of kings who drink from chalices of blood, yet the idea of consuming the next generation is disturbingly familiar. Consider how modern empires, corporations, governments, even families, often sacrifice their children in different ways, not with teeth and flesh, but with exploitation, expectation, and neglect. Generations burned out so that a name, a brand, or a fortune might endure. The curse lives on, disguised in modern clothes. In politics, we still see leaders obsessed with bloodlines and dynasties. Families who cling to power for decades, even centuries, shaping nations as though they were private kingdoms. Scandals erupt, heirs collapse under pressure, yet the cycle repeats. The hunger for legacy has not vanished. It has merely shifted from banquet halls to boardrooms, from palaces to parliaments. And like the cursed rulers of old, many are willing to sacrifice those closest to them for the illusion of immortality. In culture, too, echoes remain. Our stories, films, and myths are still haunted by child-devouring parents, cursed bloodlines, and families undone by their own hunger. From Gothic horror to modern fantasy, the same themes reappear: innocence sacrificed, power sustained through forbidden acts, love twisted into obsession. These tales grip us because they speak to something primal, the fear that those who should protect us might one day consume us instead. Even in science, the metaphor lingers. Genetic experiments, cloning, the dream of extending human life, all reflect humanity's obsession with bloodlines and survival. How far would we go to preserve ourselves? Would we sacrifice ethics, innocence, even our own kin? In chasing immortality, are we not flirting with the same hunger that damned the cursed dynasty? But perhaps the most unsettling modern parallel is silence. Just as servants once whispered about vanished heirs, we whisper today about scandals hidden in plain sight. Children sacrificed not in ritual chambers, but in cycles of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Lives lost to preserve wealth, image, or power. The methods have changed, but the hunger remains the same. This is why the dynasty's story endures. It is not simply history, not merely myth. It is a mirror, a reflection of how easily love can be twisted by power, how quickly legacy can become obsession, how naturally the strong prey upon the weak when they believe survival demands it. The curse is not locked in the past, it breathes in our present. And so the question their story leaves us with is no longer about them. It is about us. How much of the curse do we still carry? When we look at our families, our societies, our leaders, how often do we see innocence sacrificed for ambition? How often do we see tomorrow consumed to sustain today? The dynasty may be gone, their bones buried, their palaces in ruin. Yet their hunger has not died. It has simply changed form, lingering in shadows where we least expect it. Perhaps that is the true horror of the curse, not that it destroyed one bloodline, but that it revealed a truth about humanity itself, a truth we would rather not face. Because maybe, in the end, the curse was never theirs alone. Maybe it is ours.